Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, our closest cousins. 5 intriguing things about chimps, presented by Mark Jordahl. Mark is NatHab's head of communications and has guided trips for us in Uganda since 2016. Thank you so much for being here today, Mark. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much, Kendall, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm excited to be doing this webinar. I've wanted to do a webinar on chimps for quite a while. I have been leading mountain gorilla trips for years and I always kind of thought of myself as a mountain gorilla guide. And chimps were sort of another cool stop along the way to the mountain gorillas that worked out well to go see them in the forest. And I love being in the forest, so it worked out great. But I didn't really give them the credit they deserved. And it really was over time that my fascination with them developed. And chimps were always sort of part of my family lore. My mom, who I think is on this call, hi Mom, she passed her biology orals by bringing in some information from Jane Goodall that her professors didn't know about yet. And I was excited to be able to tell that story to Jane in Uganda about 10 years ago, and she responded with that sweet smile she has that has made people fall in love with primates and conservation of primates for decades. But personally, I was still focused on mountain gorillas, really. And then one day I heard a story from a researcher in Kibale Forest in Uganda near Murchison Falls. And he was part of a group of habituators who were trying to get a group of chimps comfortable enough around humans that they could be studied doing their natural behaviors. And they'd been doing it for a few weeks and the chimps had gotten pretty comfortable with them. They weren't showing any fear, they weren't showing any aggression. And one day about 15 of the chimps just dropped out of a tree and charged at the researchers, the habituators, shrieking and pounding and tearing up leaves, and a pretty ferocious display, as chimps can do. And the researchers didn't understand. They didn't know what was going on because they had reached this level with these chimps. And you know, they kind of backed off, and then they saw 3 of the chimps standing in one spot looking down at the ground, and there was a big python there on the forest floor that they hadn't seen. So the chimps had come down to warn off the habituators from this python. So that was a real eye-opener, like, okay, there's a lot going on here with these chimps. So kind of my fascination with them has grown since that time. I know that in the description of this webinar, if you read it, they referred to me as a primate expert. I don't believe that term applies to studying primates or learning about primates. They're such sophisticated, complex individuals that it would be like calling somebody a human expert. In this webinar, I'm just taking you along on my own learning journey and talking about some of the behaviors that I've learned about with chimps that I think are most fascinating to me and that I'm excited to share on this webinar. And, you know, understanding of chimps has evolved constantly. Again, they're so complex, and researchers are just kind of starting to learn the right questions to ask. You know, they've been studied long-term since Jane Goodall in Gombe in the 60s. That's a research site that's still actively used, and new stuff is coming out all the time. They're just fascinating creatures. And yeah, there's much more learning to come, I'm absolutely sure. I'm going to actually turn off my webcam now until we get to the question and answer session, just so that it's not in the way. All right. And let's see if I can get it to advance the slide. Okay. So thinking about research on chimpanzees obviously brings us to Jane Goodall. She wasn't the first to study them when she set up her camp in Gombe on Lake Tanganyika, but she really changed the game for field biology of all students. She was actually originally encouraged to set up this research site by Louis Leakey, very famous anthropologist, as was Dian Fossey, who started the mountain gorilla research in the Virungas. And he really wanted them to be studying these great apes to give insights into early human development. She really had a different approach from what was considered acceptable in the scientific community at the time. First of all, she had the audacity to do field research as a woman, and fortunately broke ground and paved the way for a lot of women to work in this field to this day. But she and Dian Fossey had to really overcome some hurdles to just even be heard and respected within the scientific community. And part of it was also just how she did things. You know, this was still back at a time when you were not supposed to anthropomorphize or put any kind of human emotion onto the animals that you were studying. Instead, she saw the chimps as individuals. She named them. She recognized personalities that they each individually display. And today, nobody would consider looking at chimpanzees and not see that they are individuals, that they do have personalities, and even that within these communities, cultures develop. Another thing that was really important that she changed was just the longevity of studies. It was much more common to do 6 months or a year studying a species prior to this, and she has done it for decades. And how can you learn enough about the behaviors of an animal that lives for 40, 50 years if you're just studying them for 6 months or 1 year? It really kind of opened the ability to get a lot deeper and really understand things that, you know, if you were to study a community just for 6 months and it happened to be during a drought, you would get a very different view of what they eat, how much they travel, what their group sizes are, things like that. So, you know, by having these longitudinal studies, she was able to discover that they hunt, which was not known before that. She was able to see the ritual sharing of meat after hunting, which we'll get to a little bit later. The presence of warfare between chimp communities. And of course, you know, probably what's best known is tool use. And when she saw David Grieger fishing for termites using a stick that he had altered to fit down into the termite nest. And when she told her mentor Louis Leakey about it, his famous quote, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine human, or accept chimpanzees as humans." Because prior to this, we were known as man the tool maker, in quotes, and it was believed that we were the only species that could use tools. So it just revolutionized science when she had this insight that there actually are, as it turns out now, many more animals that do use tools, and chimpanzees were our first look into that. I tend to get a lot of questions about chimp evolution and kind of, you know, there's the mistaken belief that we evolved from chimps. We did not. We had evolved from a common ancestor and split about 7 million years ago. The chimpanzees and bonobos took one branch. They, you know, it was chimpanzees originally, bonobos branched off about a little less than 1 million years ago, and then, of course, humans. And people sometimes also ask, you know, why haven't chimpanzees evolved to be more like humans? We're so close already, sharing almost 99% of our DNA, and clearly we are the species that's doing it right, so why haven't they evolved to be more like us? But what's evolution for if not to become well adapted to your environment, to your habitat? And chimps are doing a great job in the forest environments where they live. Seeing them move through a forest so fluidly, and then comparing it to us, where we're trying not to trip over vines and we're pushing our way through, and we are clearly not the highest evolved species in their environment. We do what we can to try to move through it more gracefully, but chimps are chimps because they are so well adapted to their own environment, and they've been incredibly successful there. I love this quote from Jane Goodall. A high state of evolution should involve protecting the environment that we live in for our own long-term survival. And I think this quote just really gets to that. This is where chimpanzees are found. There are 4 subspecies of chimpanzees, and then the bonobos, which are only found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The reason that they're found in this swath of land in Africa can be seen right here. You can see how green it is. They are forest dwelling. They can live sort of in transition zones between forest and savanna. But as we'll get into a little bit later, they really thrive on the fruit trees that are found in the forests. The eastern terminus of their range comes up against the Albertine Rift here. You can see these arrows pointing to the lakes that are in the rift. And the uplift through the seismic activity here has really held back this ocean of the Congolese forest. And that has become the boundary on the eastern edge of their range. And before we get into some more of the details, I just want to bring you into, let's see if I can find this again. I just want to bring you into the forest in Kibale National Park in Uganda. Okay, in that video, I miss being in the forest with chimps just because of that sound. There's just an excitement that you feel when that's echoing through the forest. So that video was taken towards evening when the chimpanzees of a larger community were coming back together at the end of the day to get ready to build nests and to feed in a big fig tree. And the reason that they're coming back together is the way their society is structured. It's called fission fusion. And basically what that means is they live in one large community, which can range from 50 to almost 200 individuals, depending on the location. But then throughout the day, they will break off into smaller groups to travel and feed, and some of their mating happens when they're branched out. And this structure really feeds into a lot of the other topics that I'm going to talk about today. It's a very complex social structure. It takes a pretty sophisticated brain to manage it, because you're constantly, every day, as you head out in your subgroup from the parent community, you're having to make a series of decisions. Who are you going out with? Where are you going? Where are you going to find food? Social dynamics, like your status within that smaller group, is constantly having to be negotiated, rather than just being within one consistent small group where all of that is established. You need to know how to get back to the parent group at the end of the day. And a lot of plotting happens during these breakouts, basically, with these smaller groups. There are a lot of politics within chimpanzee society that we'll be talking about a little bit later. And think about what it means for an alpha chimp. There's one alpha, one dominant male for that larger community of up to 200 chimps. And he spends most of the day having no idea what the rest of the community is doing, because they're so spread out, compared to a family of mountain gorillas, where it's a small group of 8 to 20 family members spending the whole day in close proximity, and the silverback knows everything that's happening within that small group. For chimpanzees, the alpha male, they are basically always stressed out. Their cortisol levels are very high, because when everybody is spread out throughout the forest, he can't keep an eye on them, and he doesn't know what they're planning. So he always has to be prepared for an attack on his status. And frequently when, at the end of the day, when the subgroups come back together, there's often a lot of aggression on the part of the alpha male because he's trying to reestablish his dominance and make sure that everybody remembers that he's the boss. So what are some of the advantages? If this is a setup that's so stressful for the alpha male, why does this this structure persist? And as with most animals, it really all comes down to food and sex. The fission-fusion structure requires a large brain. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff you're tracking, you're constantly renegotiating relationships, you're heading out to find food. There's a lot going on. An adult chimpanzee averages about 100 pounds. Mountain gorillas range from about 250 for an adult female up to about 500 pounds for a male. But despite these dramatically different body sizes, they have pretty much the same size brain. So clearly chimpanzees have developed a very large brain for their body size, just as we have as humans. For the mountain gorillas, they have it pretty easy. They eat leaves. They're pretty much always surrounded by their food, and their food is pretty low quality. They eat pounds and pounds and pounds of leaves every day. They live a pretty sedentary life, rarely moving more than a mile in a day. They don't have to catch those leaves to eat. They don't have to wonder where the leaves are growing. They're all around them. So two factors in keeping their brain size smaller is that the nutrition level isn't enough to really grow their brains very large. And secondly, they don't really need big brains either socially because they have a pretty fixed social dynamic over a lot of years. And they don't really need to think about where they're going to find their food. Chimps, however, their diet is much more varied and it takes a lot more thought to find it, and it takes a lot more energy to go out and gather it. Next. So sugars are really what allow brains to get big. You can see from this picture with these canines here, chimps are well equipped for hunting. They do hunt small mammals like red colobus monkeys, small antelopes like duikers, bush babies, which are a small nocturnal primate that they actually make spears to get out of holes in trees. And hunting any animal takes cooperation and coordination within the hunting parties. So there's complexity in the thought process that goes into that. And there's an additional political component to it that involves sharing of the meat afterwards and who gets what shares. But meat is only a pretty small part of their diet. It probably is more important politically than it is nutritionally for them. And if meat eating explained larger brains, lions would be flying a space shuttle. They do also eat invertebrates, mushrooms, leaves, and even soil. They'll eat dirt, and it's believed that some of the organic material and minerals in there neutralizes toxins in some of the other foods that they eat. But mostly, chimps like figs. They are definitely frugivores. They're fruit eaters. And figs have a lot of sugar, and large brains really love sugar. So they have a high nutritional food, but they're not always surrounded by figs. They need to know where they're going to find them, and they need to have the energy to sometimes travel kilometers across the forest to gather them. Here in the northern hemisphere, we're kind of used to these seasonal cycles with fruits and nuts. We know which berries will be ripe in the spring. We look forward to apples in the fall. Evergreen cones mature in late summer so that squirrels can stock up for winter. And this creates a superabundance all at once so that seed predators don't eat them all. They'll catch some, they'll hide them under trees, and they don't get back to them all. Some of those take root and grow. But with figs, because they're in an equatorial setting, they don't have clear seasons like that. So they fruit around the whole calendar year, and they intentionally, if you can give intention to a tree, do not fruit when another one nearby is also in fruit, because they want to spread their seeds as far as they can. So they want to be the only game in town. So the chimps need to have the brain power to know where to go, where to find the fruits at any given time of year, and memory plays a big role in this. They've been seen to repeatedly visit and check first on trees that have served them well in the past. So there's another advantage to fission-fusion society. You know, if the food source is spread out and random throughout the forest, you don't want 150 chimps all feeding on this one tree. Nobody's going to get very much food. So breaking into these smaller groups allows them to spread around and tap into food resources in more parts of the forest, and not to have too much competition for one fruiting tree. Yeah, and this, you can, if you see his face, he has it kind of wedged there inside his lip. It's called a wodge. And nobody really knows why exactly they do this. They think it might be to just sort of squeeze out extra juices, extra flavor. It might be to just filter out some of the fiber in the fruit, but chimps do, it's almost like a tobacco chew in their bottom lip. Chimps are really important parts of forest health, the ecology of the forest. A large rainforest fig tree has a massive canopy. It might cover an acre or two of land, and it prevents new growth from coming up underneath. So those trees need to have strategies to spread those seeds as far as they possibly can. They can't just let the fruits drop on the ground. And different species within the forest specialize on different foods. Monkeys like red tails, when they eat fruits, they engage in what's called fine oral processing. They basically do what we try to get all our kids to do. They chew their food really well. But then with the seeds, they end up just spitting them out right where they're eating. So they don't go very far from the parent tree. With the chimps eating figs, that strategy wouldn't work for the fig tree because those seedlings can't get started underneath the parent fig. So chimps just happen to swallow the figs or fig seeds whole, and then they carry it with them for a mile or two through the forest, where they drop it with a nice little fertilizer packet farther from the tree. And a single dropping can have hundreds of seeds in it, which, if you look kind of closely at this, you can see some of the smaller seeds in here. And chimps aren't the only seed dispersers. This is some elephant dung, and you can see that that's very successfully acting as a nursery for these seedlings that are coming up here. But elephants eat much larger fruits. They tend to eat ferocious and things like that. So again, different species specialize in different seeds and different fruits in the forest. So to maintain the diversity, you really need the same mix of dispersers. And there's a lot of concern as primate numbers are dropping across Africa. What will that mean for the forests and the tree species that rely on these individual dispersers? Their mating habits are very fascinating, and fission-fusion, that social structure, has a really big impact on mating. In a lot of mammal species like wolves or lions, the alpha male very rigidly controls breeding, and most of the offspring in the group are his. For mountain gorillas, the dominant silverback is the father of at least 85% of the young. In chimpanzees, it's more like a third to maybe a half, depending on the size of the community. As the community gets bigger, as there are more males and more females, that gets diluted, so it's at the lower end of the scale, but it's pretty rare for the alpha to sire more than half of the young in the community. they sometimes an alpha male will guard a female that he's particularly interested in and prevent other males from accessing her, but in general the females mate with many males while they're in estrus. One female at Jane Goodall's site in Gombe was observed mating 65 times with 18 different males in 11 hours. So it's a pretty promiscuous system. But it's not really a surprise when you think about this fission fusion where the chimps are spread out across the entire forest. No alpha could really control mating in that situation, no matter how big or intimidating he is. So it really, mate selection on the part of females isn't as big a deal. They're not looking for the biggest and the strongest male. It really becomes more an issue of sperm competition. Since she's mating with a bunch of different males, it's the sperm that will either make or break who becomes the father. And male chimps have, rather than developing a huge body like mountain gorillas did, they've developed large testicles, and their testicles weigh 4 times as much as a gorilla's. So that's the strategy that they've taken on to become the father of more of the offspring. And this does give lower status males the opportunity to mate, which again is something that doesn't occur that frequently in other mammal species. Sometimes it'll happen while these subgroups are off foraging during the day. Sometimes male and female will do what's called going on safari, and they'll slip off for a couple days or a couple weeks. But yeah, you can see here that the infants have a very strong bond with the females. It is one thing with the males not knowing whose child this is. They're less likely to be aggressive towards the infant. They're also less likely to have a strong individual bond with the infant. So it's really the mother. The babies stay with the mother till they're about 7. They're weaned at 3. So this ends up being a very strong and important relationship between the young and the mothers. And for the females, again, because they're not so much worried about access to males to mate with, their main priority is just making sure that they have access to a good food source so that when they have a baby, they can raise it to adulthood. So that gets into what has gained a lot of attention is warfare within chimpanzee communities. This is definitely something that happens. There are coalitions of males within the chimpanzee community. The way it works with chimps is that the females disperse, the males stay in their natal community. So there tend to already be kind of strong familial bonds between the males. And they will put together a coalition to go out and patrol the boundary of their territory. And it can have one of two goals. Either they're just trying to defend their territory against a neighboring community, or they're trying to do an incursion into a neighboring territory to kind of capture more land or kill off some of the males from that neighboring group. And Jane Goodall was the first to kind of record this behavior of warfare, and later research has supported these findings that they do wage war, and sometimes it'll happen over a period of months where these patrols will go out to the edge of the boundary, try to find 1 or 2 single males together, and they will kill them. And it all comes down to numbers. If a patrol is out approaching a neighboring territory and they realize that the neighboring territory has a coalition that's as large or larger than their own, they'll immediately retreat. They will pretty much never attack if the numbers are equal or stronger. So another thing about these patrols, it's also an important part of relationship building between the males. And this kind of gets us into chimpanzee politics. And I think this is a very fascinating time to be thinking about this. But first, yeah, so this picture is a patrol of chimps heading out to their boundary. And you can just kind of see the intent and the direct movement here. And as they approach the neighboring territory, they'll get really quiet and tense and start to be kind of on edge. So there's a lot of thought that goes into these patrols. There's a lot of strategizing, and even just selecting which males will be part of an individual patrol is part of that evidence of a complex brain. You know, there's a lot of decision making that goes on within chimp communities. So yeah, so chimps are very, very political. To become an alpha chimp, it's not necessarily the biggest and the most aggressive who becomes the alpha or who becomes dominant. It's the best coalition builder. It's the one who can get the most friends together to work on his side and support his bid for dominance. You can be a weaker male, but if you can put together a strong coalition, you can defeat a stronger male because you have your team backing you up. These patrols are one of the ways that they start to develop these relationships, find out who's a reliable ally. When they hunt on a patrol, the chimp who is aiming to rise up in the ranks will share meat more generously with the other males that he wants to have on his side. Again, these are often related males who do these patrols, so they already have some level of interest and support in passing on their shared genes. But you're showing your support if you go on a patrol that's been organized by a specific chimp. And then interestingly, probably kind of similar to our elections as well, once that male achieves that higher state, he suddenly gets a lot more less generous with sharing the meat. So it's kind of a lot of promises leading up to it, and then that generosity reduces once they're there. Average tenure for an alpha is about 4 years, so same as our presidential slot. And you have to think about, if it's that difficult and stressful to be an alpha in a fission fusion society, why do they do it? If you're only going to be an alpha for 4 years, you're probably not going to sire that many additional young. But there seems to be some benefit to it in longevity. And we actually have seen that in US history as well. The first 8 US presidents had a lifespan of 80 years on average. And this is in the 17 and 1800s when average life expectancy was 38 years. So even though they were, part of the elite, had better nutrition and medical care, it doesn't necessarily explain a doubling of life expectancy. And sure enough, with the chimps as well, the average lifespan for a male that doesn't become an alpha is about 25 and a half years. If you have been an alpha, it's 33 and a half years. So you generally will lose your dominance about the same time that other males die on average, and then you'll live another 8 years. So there must be some benefit that just hasn't been identified yet that leads to that longevity even afterwards. And also similar to our presidents, even after being deposed as an alpha within a chimp community, you still continue to have a pretty strong influence on the community as a whole. Another Gombe chimp named Goblin, he was a dominant chimp. He got deposed, and he ended up for years being known as a kingmaker because any male who wanted to become the alpha would have to curry favor with him. And then he would kind of bring the support that was needed and back that male up in its bid for dominance. So it really is kind of a lot of politics going on. And one of the things that I kind of take some solace in thinking about chimps in relation to our current political situation is that there's a reconciliation process that happens with chimps after there been some kind of a conflict, whether it's a dominance challenge for alpha or some mid-level dominance challenge. There is a reconciliation that happens afterwards, and sometimes it's actually mediated by another chimp, often one of these older males. And the alpha male actually plays an incredibly active role in comforting less dominant chimps in any kind of a stressful, aggressive interaction. When you're looking at the kind of middle to low rank chimps, the females tend to do most of the comforting, but then when you get to the high ranking chimps, it's the alpha male by far does the most comforting of the other chimps. And to some extent, that is just garnering more support. If you're providing care and comfort to your community members, they're going to support you for longer. But all of this just gives me hope that, you know, no matter how ugly our politics can get, we do have deep in our shared DNA this desire to comfort and to reconcile our differences and move forward. So finally, I just want to touch a little bit on chimp conservation. There are about 300,000 chimps in the world. Throughout Central Africa is sort of the current estimate, down from about 1 million at the beginning of the 1900s. I always take these numbers with a grain of salt because so many chimps live in Congo, and Congo is such a difficult place to get solid data from. But we can be pretty sure that their numbers are declining. This is a lot of it. Deforestation. Forests are shrinking throughout Africa, whether it's for logging, for other resource extraction, mining, charcoal. You know, roads are making it easier for poachers to get in. There's a lot of forest destruction going on. So that's kind of one of the biggest threats to chimps and primates across Africa. Mountain gorillas are actually the only great ape species in the world that has an increasing population, and the rest of the great apes and most other primates are reducing in numbers. So doing what we can to protect these forests is very important, and these just make me so sad. It's something that we see everywhere, and these types of pictures fuel the illegal pet trade. Chimps are really cute when they're babies, and then by the time they're 5 years old, they're as strong as an adult male human. By about 10 years, they're 3 to 5 times stronger than us. And their wild nature, they do not make good pets. And when people see how cute they look in these pictures, it does fuel the pet trade. And to extract a baby from one of these communities, it does end up requiring often killing of the adults that are protecting the babies. So, you know, I like to, these are from, you know, all the leading stock photo companies have pictures like this on their sites. I like to write to them and encourage them not to have these anymore. Animal selfies in general, you see, you know, we all love putting the pictures of us with the elephant or the lemur on our arm or something like that. But again, that leads to this imbalanced sense of the fact that these are wild animals. They have dignity. We should respect them, and they belong in the wild. So, you know, if you do see a picture like this, comment on it. Tell the person, hey, you know, I understand how cute it is, and out of respect for these animals, I really encourage you not to post pictures like this again. So not to end on a down note, but it's really encouraging that there are people like Jane Goodall and the Jane Goodall Institute who are out there really fighting against things like this, against the forest destruction. Our partners at World Wildlife Fund are doing incredible work throughout Africa, and everywhere that primates live throughout the world. So there are people doing great work to try to turn these numbers around and have us start seeing more of these amazing cousins of ours out in the forest. So I'm going to turn my video back on and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Mark. Your mom is watching and she says hi. I'd like to remind folks watching, if you have a question for Mark, you can submit that in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, so there were a few people who wrote in wondering why some of the chimps seem to have lighter skin and some have darker skin. Do you know why this is?
It's just the variations in genetics there. The babies all start out with pink faces, pink hands, and then as they get older, they tend to start to lose. So by about a year, their faces, hands, feet are black. And then as they get older, for some of them, their pigmentation starts to fade. So a lot of older chimps have kind of a speckled pink face, and a lot of them even look like they have freckles. So there's incredible variation of what chimpanzees look like. If you Google chimpanzee image, it's hard to even believe they're the same species sometimes. When you look at the variation in hair length, you have some that are like this one on the image right now on the screen with a little bald spot in the front. Some look like they have a bouffant hairdo coming across. So yeah, and as they get older, their chins will turn gray, their arms and their backs will turn a little bit gray. So yeah, there's incredible variation in that coloration.
Okay. And there was a question on if males are the only ones who hunt.
For the most part, yes. Again, it changes a lot depending on where you are in the size of the community. So if you're in a smaller community, then the females will play a more active role both in hunting and in patrolling the boundaries. In a larger community, like the one in Kibale that's 130, 150, something like that, the females almost never get involved in that. But they are often the recipients of the meat sharing process later. And I don't know if I even really got into that, but the post-hunt process does involve a ritual sharing of meat. So a male who is seeking dominance will very selectively choose who receives extra shares of the meat from the hunt.
Okay. And are there alpha females?
Yes. So there are, but again, it's not the kind, it's basically the female who has the closest relationship with the alpha male. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean as much because all the females are mating, all of the males are mating. So it's not like a wolf situation where only the male and female alphas will mate. But yeah, so it's a tighter bond, a tighter relationship. And the female offspring of more dominant females do have longer life expectancy. They do tend to mate more and have more successful raising of young. So there are advantages to being an alpha or a high-ranking female for the success of your daughter.
Okay. And you mentioned the male gangs. Are they part of a larger community or are they off on their own?
They are. So all of these, so let's say you have a group of 150 chimps. The coalitions of males who go on patrol are not necessarily the same ones who together are breaking out into these subgroups for feeding and foraging during the day. The subgroups are different every single day. And frequently when there's either a good food source or just a good nesting site, or when the alpha just decides he wants to check in on everybody, they'll kind of call everybody back in. And then that's kind of a good time to do the planning. So again, even the patrols won't necessarily be the same chimps every time, the same male chimps. If you go on a raid and basically aren't pulling your weight, you won't be invited the next time. There are certain, especially young adolescents, who seem to just love charging in and doing the patrols and getting in the battles. They're selected and brought along frequently. But Yeah, so these are patrols that are kind of gathered from the larger group. They're not always the same in the coalition, and the coalition can change on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. And sort of along those same lines, there's a lot of curiosity about different troops maybe attacking each other, you know, warring, and the communication involved in that. And if there's a planning stage, for example, and also, do they respect their dead like other wildlife do?
Yeah, so I'll answer that second one first, because this was something I was reading about actually pretty recently, that I can't remember if it was in Gombe or Mahale, one of the research sites, they did record chimps. An alpha had died in this one spot in the forest. They went and groomed his body, and then moved it somewhere, but then even returning to that same spot after the carcass was gone, the chimps would get quiet, they'd move more slowly. It was almost like they were just taking a moment of respect, walking through that area. So yeah, and then mothers, if their infants died, they've been known to carry them around for 2 or 3 days. So yeah, they definitely do have that sense of death. And maybe some of it, you know, chimps are one of the few species that has self-awareness. They can recognize themselves in a mirror, they'll recognize themselves again a year later. So maybe there's even some awareness that someday that will be them. I really don't know. And sorry, what was the first question?
There's just a lot of curiosity about troops attacking other troops and maybe how that relates to human activity in war, and whether there's any sort of like communication in terms of planning or during it.
Right. Well, so in terms of the planning stage, it's kind of hard to say what they're communicating. There's enough of a planning stage that they determine who's going to go in that particular patrol and then where they're going to go. But once they get to the boundary of their territory, that's when it comes down to numbers. So they will communicate out. They'll be making some noise and trying to get some response from the other side. And then if there are 8 of them and they hear 12 on the other side, they're going to get out of there. Or they might all approach quietly, and then even that takes a certain amount of coordination because they all know to kind of get silent at the same time, and they will actually make incursions into the neighboring territory. And these patrols are all about food resources. They're not about mating or anything like that. So if you are in a kind of a poor quality habitat, you're more likely to try to take over a neighboring territory that might have better food resources. So I think at Ngogo, there was basically this war that took place over 3 months where the males who felt like they were stronger but didn't know how much stronger, they would kind of keep just sneaking into the other territory, picking off one male, until finally they had weakened the other community enough that they were able to go in and actually annex that territory. So I feel like I kind of went off on a tangent there and didn't really answer that.
No, that was good.
I guess I would say, yeah, there's a lot of communication that goes on, but as humans, it's really hard for us to interpret exactly what they're saying to each other. Yeah.
Got it. Perfect. So there was a question about chimps' hearing and vision. It seems like they have pretty large ears. Are you able to compare their vision and hearing with humans?
I've heard that their vision is about the same as humans. I haven't heard about the hearing. Just my guess is that given the forest environment that they live in, they probably need to be more auditory than visual because so much of their communication is vocal. Everything from the calls they do to the buttressing where they pound on the buttressed roots of trees in the forest. They're really trying to communicate over miles. So just my guess, between the observation that you just mentioned of the size of the ears and the environment they live in, I would expect it to be stronger, but that's going to be part of my next research.
Nice. So when chimps in the wild get habituated to humans, do they kind of generalize humans as a whole, or are they more comfortable with particular people?
They definitely know individuals. Yeah. They're, again, they're incredibly intelligent. And, even like, let's say when we are bringing a group of NatHab guests in to visit chimps or mountain gorillas, the chimps are calmer because we're there with the park staff that they see on a daily basis. So there's sort of like our free pass in. So the advantage to that is that if, let's say, a poacher were to go in, somebody of face that they did not recognize, an individual they didn't recognize, they would be more cautious. So there's a definite advantage to that individual recognition.
Okay, that's actually a good segue into another question of mine. A few people are curious about our NatHab trips and where we can see chimps, and if you can just tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these pictures are actually from our trips in, so Kibale National Park is the place that we go chimp trekking. Right, it may be that over time we will also add that to Rwanda. Rwanda is trying to develop its chimp tracking, but they don't have very many chimps that are habituated yet or anything like that. So it's really our Uganda trips where we do get good quality time with the chimps. But yeah, so it's in Kibale National Park, which is in western Uganda, just a little bit north of where the gorillas are. There are chimps also in Bwindi where the gorillas are. It's the only place where mountain gorillas and chimps share habitat, but those are not habituated. So we go 2 times. We do one visit in the morning and one visit in the afternoon on 2 different days because behaviors tend to be different at different times. Weather can be different. And the trekking tends to be easier than the mountain gorillas, although we spend more time off trail. So you do kind of need to watch your footing and everything. Like that picture that I showed, there are vines across the ground and it can be easy to trip. The actual experience with the chimps varies a lot from day to day, from trip to trip, because again, you might happen upon them when they are coming together as a larger community. I've had times when, I've gone in and been with 60 of them. Even one time there was a new alpha male, Tutsi. They had just kind of regathered, like that video that I played, and especially because he was a new male, he was really showing his oats. He wanted to remind everybody that he was the new alpha. So he was actually running through. He grabbed me on the leg. He was very just running right between everybody. So that was a very exciting encounter. Sometimes you're lucky to see 3 running through the forest, moving from one feeding area to another. So I would say almost every time we see some chimps, and it's really difficult to know if you're gonna have 50 of them right around you down on the ground where you can get great pictures, or if you're gonna have 2 or 3 way up in a fig tree where you need a neck massage afterwards from taking pictures straight up. But I hope some of what I've conveyed here is just how incredibly fascinating chimp dynamics and chimp society is. And even if you're just seeing 2 or 3, once you have more context to what they're doing out there, it's just fascinating to watch and see what they're doing. And it's just amazing to be out in, an equatorial rainforest. It's an amazing experience.
Absolutely. And the final question is related to this. How difficult is the hiking to see the mountain gorillas and the chimps?
Yeah, like I said, I would say in general, the chimps are easier. The terrain's not as steep. You're not at the same elevation. You're more around 4,000 feet instead of 6,000 to 8,000 feet. You do need to have decent footing because, again, we are off trail a lot. There are often vines and roots and things like that. but it tends to be a quicker hike. We're usually in with the chimps within an hour, hour and a half, something like that, depending on where they're moving. I've had some extreme cases where we have had to go down into some ravines, but that's pretty uncommon. The gorilla trekking can really vary a lot as well, but in general, expect the gorilla trekking to be harder. You're at a higher elevation, the terrain is much steeper. You know, windy is just these volcanic folds in the ground. The forest is much more dense, so when you are off trail, you're really pushing through undergrowth to get to where the gorillas are, and you can be out there for 6 or 8 hours. And I think 2 trips ago, I had one time where we could see the gorillas from the truck where we were getting dropped off at the trailhead. So I have to admit that was a little bit of a disappointment because I actually really enjoyed the part of it, but that just kind of gives you a sense of the variation that you can have.
Yeah, you just never know.
Say, yeah, if you are considering this trip, start getting in shape in advance, and really practice walking on hills if you can, either going up and down stairs at a stadium, finding a nearby trail that goes up into some hills. But you know, walking a couple miles along Miami Beach is not the same as hiking through the jungle at 8,000 feet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you have any further questions about the trips, for those watching, you can give us a call or email us at the information on the screen.
Yeah.
All right, it's almost the top of the hour, so I'm going to throw it back to you, Mark, for closing comments.
All right. Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, I was really excited to do this. I really find chimps fascinating, and I love the fact that they were kind of there right in front of me, and I didn't notice them enough. I didn't appreciate how incredible they are as a species, and I know that this is just the beginning of me continuing to learn more and more about them, because it's, like I said, like humans, it's not like you're ever going to run out of things to learn about chimps. And they're incredibly dynamic and exciting to see in the wild. I hope as many of you as possible do get a chance to see them. And I really hope that we are able to work together as a world to make sure that they're still here for our children and grandchildren.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. This was really fascinating. It was such a pleasure to have you with us today. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.